Hey everybody. So making a short video here, I'm going to talk about all the Dwarven heroes in the game so far. I'm going to kind of rate them. I don't have a clear hardcore rating system and I'm not going to rank them like top 10 or anything like that. There are only 12 so far at this stage in the game of where I am. So that's one of the caveats that I do want to point out. I'm only ranking the dwarves or discussing them, rating them in terms of the ones that are out where I am because I'm opening and going through progression style. Another caveat too, when I talk about these, in my opinions are going to be tempered by the fact that I play solo, and I play one-handed solo. So I think that some of these dwarves could be evaluated differently in a different context of either playing two-handed or playing multiplayer in general. So I do want you to be aware of that. And another caveat is, even though I've played the game, I've played over 100 times, all told. I don't consider myself an expert. There's probably still a lot for me to learn about the game. So let's just go ahead and get into it, and you'll see my comments as we go. And I'm just got them alphabetical here, so I don't want to, look prejudiced by putting them in a certain order or anything like that. So it's just alphabetical. Okay, so the first dwarf here is we've got Balin. He's a later, I think he's the Hobbit. He's from the Hobbit cycle, I'm pretty sure. No, Balin I don't really rate that highly, and I don't think I've really played with him, not seriously, except just like to test him out and stuff. He's, a standard boilerplate leadership access dwarf. He has his ability, and a lot of how I rate them is based on their ability, right? His response is that you can pay a resource to cancel a shadow effect, which is good in that you don't have to have, hasty stroke, I think it is. You don't have to take up a spot in your deck devoting a card to that. The downside is that you still deal another shadow card to the attacking enemy, so you could just get something worse. It's not really that great unless you somehow have perfect knowledge of the encounter deck and you know exactly what the replacement shadow effect would be. But I don't think that there's any way for you to cheat in that in between. There's no way to do that. There's no, at least not in the card pool now. You would need an action window. You wouldn't have an action window. So Balin is just kind of meh in terms of just, he just is. I don't really use him that much or at all. Next up, we've got Bifur, the lore hero. And Bifur I rate very highly, actually. There's two main reasons. One is that it's because he's a lore dwarf. Any lore dwarf heroes are going to be rated higher for me, and that's because there are so many useful, important dwarven cards in lore. Just starting from the core set with Hammersmith and the Miner. The Miner's not amazing, but the Hammersmith I use him constantly. He's great. So just lore is an important sphere for dwarf decks in general. A second reason is that his threat cost is cheaper than it should be. It's 7. It's the standard method or whatever is their threat cost is equal to the sum of all of their other stats. His is 1 less. So there's a little bit of value there. And I don't know if that's because his action is allegedly not good or what. But personally I think his action is good. You can basically take a resource. He can take a resource from somebody once a turn. So it's kind of like acceleration for green, which again is really good actually because there's so many great green cards. There's, you can have that 1 extra to power your Erebor Record Keeper to ready a hero, which is really relevant when I get to another hero coming up here. Or extra to power the Map Maker, or just get more green cards out in general. There's just a lot of good green cards. So in general, I do like to play with Bifur quite a bit. The only downside to playing with Bifur, and here's the downside, is we also have Ally Bifur, who when you control 5 dwarves, when you play him from your hand, you draw 2 cards. So that's cool, because basically if you have 5, you pay 3 and you get to draw 2 cards. So you have to pick. You would forego that card draw engine if you're using Bifur because he's unique. So it can be scenario dependent. Generally, I will be playing Bifur though, unless I just really want a lot of card draw. But there's so many other ways to draw cards when you're playing dwarves anyway that you can probably get, go without Bifur ally. So love Bifur. Next up we have Bombur, another lore hero. He's got 5 hit points, which is pretty good. It'd be nice if he had 3 defense though, because really you're just going to use this guy to defend. His other stats are terrible, or he has no will. His ability is that when you count the number of dwarf characters you control, he counts as 2, which is a great inside joke. It's directly referencing the flavor text here where they're going to visit Bjorn, and so Gandalf says he should come last because he counts for 2 because he's so big. And there's a couple of other references of Bombur being a hefty boy in The Hobbit as well. So this one is sort of like a joke instantiated inside of a Lord of the Rings Living Card game card. So flavor-wise, it's really great. However, there's only 3 heroes total that care about you having 5 dwarf characters, or your number of dwarf characters. And I don't think there's any other cards that care about you having a minimum. And there might be more that come up later. I don't know. I'm not sure. I couldn't find any in the little bit of research I did. I try to not do too much research to spoil myself. But given that there's not that many people or cards that care about that, it's kind of irrelevant. In a dwarf deck, I mean, the archetype is called Dwarf Swarm. It's just so easy to get 5 dwarves anyway that it's not really that relevant. Bombur's just not really doing anything for you. But it's a great flavor card. I mean, I like it, but I'm not going to really play with it probably. Next up is Dain Ironfoot. There's not really much to say about him. He is the best dwarven hero. Well, as long as you're playing a dwarf deck. If you're not playing a dwarf deck, pretty different. Then you can evaluate him completely differently. But assuming you're playing a dwarf deck and you have tons of dwarven allies, like 30 allies or more of dwarves, which often at this point I'm going to be doing, then he's outstanding. He's also good in multiplayer because it's just all dwarf characters. It's not just ones you control. And it's not other dwarf characters, meaning if you use Cram, or if you've powered the Erebor Record Keeper, because Bifur had some extra resources, you can ready him right back up, and he boosts himself. So Dain is obviously the dwarf lord, the dwarf god. He is amazing. You pretty much always want him in a deck. In a dwarf deck, all things being equal, if you did nothing but switch him out for a different leadership hero, then your win rate percentage is going to drop dramatically. It's that big of a difference to have +1 will, especially if you have a dwarf swarm, then that can be a massive swing in the amount you're committing to a quest on any given turn. So Dain is amazing. The best, I'll just say it now, he is the number 1. I mean, that goes without saying, I think. Next we have Dwalin. Dwalin was in the Khazad-dûm box. And originally I really liked him. So he is spirit, but he has 2 attack, which is rare for spirit to have 2 attack. I think Dun here is the only one that has 2 attack if it's a spirit hero. And spirit often needs a little bit of help with fighting. And I often need it just because I don't really run tactics. And whenever he attacks and destroys an orc enemy, you get to lower your threat by 2. So he has built-in threat reduction, which fired a lot in those Khazad-dûm scenarios because so many of them, you're being attacked constantly by orc enemies. So in essence, it would trigger almost every turn. So you could really get your threat really low, go into secrecy pretty easily. I use Dwalin quite a bit. I would try to use him and get some tactics, some axes on him and stuff like that to make his attack even better. And so he was great. I feel like I've kind of cooled on him as things have progressed and other heroes have come out, especially in the Hobbit box. I don't run him as much, but if you are playing those original Khazad-dûm scenarios, you probably want to consider having him in there just because you're going to be fighting a lot of orc enemies and it's just a lot of help. So that's how I feel about Dwalin. After Dwalin is Gimli, son of Gloin, core set hero. One of two dwarves in the core set, or three dwarves. Yeah, there's plenty of dwarves in the core set. But anyway, so as he takes damage, for every damage token on him, he gets +1 attack. So he starts off with 2. He's got 5 hit points. You get some wounds on him. His attack goes up. You throw some armor on him. That leadership attachment that gives dwarves an extra hit point. This and that. So then you can have 5, 6, 7 wounds on him and just this massive attack. He can be quite a beast. He was very useful in those early days. And it's also really cool because he's a tactics hero that has 2 willpower. So he's really useful, actually. The problem with running a lot of tactics heroes, especially in solo, is that it can be very hard to get your questing done. And you got to have willpower because you have to quest, otherwise you can't win the game. You can win the game without ever killing an enemy in general, unless the scenario specifies you have to. But you got to have willpower. But Gimli has 2 will. That's really rare for tactics heroes. I don't think there are any tactics heroes that I can think of off the top of my head, at least, that have 2 will. So he was very useful, but he doesn't really see play for me anymore. But I did enjoy using him really early on quite a bit. He's one of those. He was one of the stronger heroes when you just have the core set. So, and then next up is his dad, Gloin, and they're kind of similar actually in the way they work with their abilities. So Gimli gets stronger as he takes wounds. Gloin, every time he suffers damage, you add a resource to his resource pool. I never really used him much. I probably have played a game with using him before. But in general, I didn't find his ability very useful. A couple of reasons. One is he's leadership. Leadership already has a lot of ways to gain resources anyway. Steward of Gondor, for example, and just other ways. Second is he has to suffer damage, but he's only got 4 hit points. I mean, it makes sense that he only has 1 defense because you do want him to you want the enemy's attacks to get through and wound him. But it can be risky. And with 4 hit points, that means you can only net 3 resources in your game. The only way to net more than that is to play other cards with healing effects, self-preservation, or that elf, Daughter of Nimrudel, or whatever, just some other cards. Now, granted, those are in a different sphere, but if you just think of your sum total of resources that you acquire throughout the course of a game, you're spending resources in order to enable his resource engine. So it feels to me like he would just be paying for himself. Like, oh, great, I got some extra resources that I can shuffle around. Maybe Bifur can take them off of him and then play a card at a lore to heal him back up. So it doesn't really... I'm not really sure how much you would net. I mean, somebody probably in the past has done the math on this. I think there was a Gloin resource engine deck early on in this game, but I think the details of it, there might be some errata that reduces effectiveness, or I don't know, maybe I could be wrong about it, but it just seems to me as though the best way for this guy to work out is, or you could suit him up with a bunch of armor like Gimli and stuff to give him more hit points, but it seems like the best way is... Either way, he's got to pay for himself. So how much you, in the long run, really going to net off of him taking damage? And how much do you want to risk him defending, when he's already got a couple of wounds on him and just risk him getting killed? I like to defend with my allies, personally. But that's Gloin. That's my opinion on Gloin. Whatever. I don't really care too much for him. Okay, next up is Nori. Nori's another spirit hero. After you play a dwarf character from your hand, reduce your threat by 1. Now, I know Nori's pretty popular. He is good. I'm not going to say he's not good, but I feel like he might be overrated in the community. But, again, what do I know? I'm not super experienced. The reason why is, at least in the way I've evolved to playing dwarves, I'm cheating dwarves in a lot of the time. And it has to be played from your hand. So that means you have to spend the resources, and it comes from your hand, and you put it into play. If you're getting them into play through sneak attack, or a very good tail, or Oh My Kindred, that other one that lets you pull a guy from your discard, those don't consider being played from your hand. So it won't trigger. So I have so many ways that I'm getting my dwarves out without playing them from my hand that I'm not going to get insane threat reduction from Nori. Now, if it were enters play, this might actually just be bonkers. That might have been what the card said originally. It was eroded, for all I know. But when it's only played from your hand, it's a little bit weaker. It's a little more contextual. And when you're playing Dwarf Swarm with Dain and you're trying to get as many dwarves out as possible, you've constructed your deck in such a way to get dwarves out without paying for them. Therefore, the usefulness of Nori is reduced. There's other spirit dwarves that are better, in my opinion. Like, I don't know. I mean, Dwalin is better in those specific quests that are combat heavy, clearly. But I guess Nori would be better than him in an overall sense. He'd have broader applicability when you're playing a dwarf deck because you'd get some benefit even from quests that are not orc combat heavy. But that's how I feel about Nori. Next up we have Owen. And this is why I don't like Nori as much. I like Owen much better. Similar stats, less defense. That's fine, whatever. 2 will. The reason I like him, he's one of the few heroes that care about you having 5 dwarf characters. And when you have those 5 dwarf characters, he gets +1 attack, and he gets the resource icon, tactics icon. So in a sense, he's cheaper because while the sum of his stats equals 8, which is what his threat cost is, you're probably going to get 5 dwarf characters in pretty quickly. So actually the sum of his stats would end up being 9. So I feel like there's value there. I feel like I'm getting a deal when I play Owen. Plus, now I have access to tactics without having to use up a tactics hero. So if I need to throw in some tactics cards, or if I want to, I can. Generally, the tactics cards that I've been running are things like Hail of Stones for direct damage. I might throw in, if I want to throw in an axe, I can. If I want to throw in Feint, some of the really useful tactics events. Now, I do sometimes run some tactics allies, but I can get those into play without having to pay for them or having access to that icon anyway. But here, what if I don't pull those cards to be able to play the tactics heroes? Then at least I'll have an icon and I can still use it. It just gives you more flexibility in constructing your deck. You can run a 4-color dwarf deck if you want when you're playing Owen. And of course he's Spirit, which is a really important sphere. So I rank him the highest Spirit ally personally, at least right now, at least in my playing right now and my thinking at this current time. Okay, next up is Ori. Ori's pretty good too. Lore, again, if they're lore, then they're going to get a bonus in my eyes. Now he's another one that cares about you having 5 dwarf characters. And what he does is you get to draw an additional card. Now again, it's super easy to get 5 dwarf characters if you're playing a dwarf deck. So you get to draw an extra card every turn. So he's kind of like Bilbo, but a dwarf. There's a slight condition, so you won't get to draw 2 cards a turn every turn. But you pretty much will, at least by turn, oftentimes on turn 1, sometimes by turn 2, by turn 3 for sure. So he's solid. Now the thing is that it's funny because the Bifur is the other who I consider the other really good one. Now comparing them, if I played Ori, I could run Bifur Ally, who draws me 2 cards when he enters play. So then it's just like, you run Ori with the Bifur Ally, you've got just a crazy card draw going on. You don't always want to draw that many cards, but you could. Because obviously if you run this guy, you're going to not have the crazy card draw going on. So it's kind of hard to compare the two, honestly. I think they're probably about equal, and it just kind of depends on what you're kind of dealing with. Like when I'm playing the one with the riddle mechanic and I'm having to discard tons of cards to do riddle tests, I don't necessarily want to draw a lot of cards because I was playing once and I ran through my deck, and once you run through your deck, you can't win any riddles, so you're screwed. So that's a good case of you don't want to play Ori because you don't want to draw tons of cards. So that's Ori. He's pretty good. Thalin, Apparently he's the best hero in the game because you can win every quest using just Thalin, allegedly, and no other cards. But besides that, that meme deck, Thalin is really not that good at all. When he's committed to the quest, deal a damage to each enemy as it's revealed. 1 damage is not going to be consequential often. I mean, you can look at the encounter deck with a probability of 1 HP enemies. There are sometimes a lot of those, and that could be useful. But you have to commit him to the quest. And that's his worst stat, his willpower. So you're using him to do the thing he's worst at so that you can get this other marginal benefit. Especially, I guess he's got more value if you're playing like 4 players or something and drawing a ton of cards off the encounter deck, but I'm just drawing 1, unless there's some case where I have to draw 2 because of the quest stage or whatever. So it's just not worth it. So Thalin I consider pretty bad. He's down there with Bombur in terms of, he's actually probably the worst actually for me for 1 player, because then he's tactics also. At least Bombur I could get lore. So that's Thalin, whatever. And then finally we have Thorin Oakenshield, King of the Mountain. He's pretty solid. I mean, he's got just high stats in general. You can see you'd be using him to quest and attack. When you have 5 dwarves, he gains a resource. So he's got resource acceleration built in there. A little bit better than Gloin because he doesn't have to take wounds. You just have to do what you're trying to do anyway. It's rewarding you for doing what a dwarf deck does naturally anyway. The only reason I wouldn't play him is because Dain exists. His cousin, I think this was his cousin, he came and bailed him out at the Battle of 5 Armies, and he became the King of the Mountain after Thorin died, but you guys know that. Just the fact that Dain exists is the reason why Thorin isn't going to see play for me, usually. And not only that, but Dain's got 1 less threat cost. I mean, Dain's just amazing. So that's what I think of all the dwarves. If I were to rank them like by sphere, Dain I'd put number 1. I'd put Bifur number 1 lore, and Owen. This is sort of like my jam right now. Is these 3 heroes, running these 3 heroes in a deck. So that's my opinion on all the dwarves up to this point. In the future, I'll do more when I get, it's elves or whatever. I just thought this would be just a little video but let me know what you guys think in terms of like, am I evaluating these correctly? Especially, remember I am solo one-handed, so that really makes a big difference, And I could see little reasons to change out. I mean, the card draw can be really useful when you're playing solo, just to give you more options. It can be more useful, I think, than multiplayer. But anyway, I hope that was fruitful for you. And but yeah, again, let me know if there's any opinion that I missed or factors in considering some of these dwarves that I missed out on. All right, thanks.